Okay, so my name is Sarah Eager. I work as a consultant psychiatrist in London. I worked in the health service for over 30 years. And I'm also chair of this organisation called the Janki Foundation. And the Janki Foundation was set up to support a hospital in India, which is run by the Brahma Kumaris in India, and it's in Rajasthan. And it serves quite a deprived area. They're sort of desert and agricultural and farming and village people. So they really didn't have much healthcare at their doorstep at all. They had to travel miles and miles. So the trust was set up, the foundation was set up to really support this hospital, and we have. Every month we send them a considerable amount of money to cover their salaries, equipment, all kinds of services, and they are deeply appreciative of that. But as part of that, Daddy Janki, who's also the administrative head of the Brahma Kumaris, she said, you can't just ask people for money, you really have to serve them. So we started doing programs, events, talking about spirituality in healthcare, because that's what's very close to our heart. And we developed a project called Values in Healthcare, which is a facilitator's manual to help health professionals look at spiritual aspects of giving care. We have these books, which you can see at the back, Heart of Wellbeing, Lifting Your Spirits, a lot of different material, really looking at how the relevance of spirituality to healthcare and how it can help support us as healthcare professionals as we're giving a lot every day, and how to really keep our own spirits up, keep that energy of compassion and real service that we all come from, to enable that to keep flowing. Because I know how hard it is these days not to feel a bit burnt out by everything that's going on. So we hope you leave today feeling refreshed and uplifted, because I know the work you do every day in, day out, it can be quite a challenge and draining, as well as rewarding. And so the Brahma Kumaris were established in India in the 1930s. They had, there was a gentleman we call Brahma Baba, who had inspiration and visions, and he felt that the world needed a different kind of spirituality, certainly to what was going on in India at the time, which was much more universal and connecting to God as light. And that has started from that small community in the 1930s now to thousands of centres all around the world, and this is an example of them. And they're all run by volunteers, as is the Janki Foundation. All services are offered freely. Just some practical things. We will be taking some photographs and recording this day to put the speakers up on the website and things like that. If you particularly don't want to be caught in any photos or anything, can you let the ushers know? Because I know some people really don't want that. Just let them know. There are toilets on this floor and near reception. Could I remind you all now to turn off your mobiles or put them on flight mode? Could you just... invariably someone forgets to look, and just at a critical time their phone goes off. Has everyone put their phone on silent, flight mode, or turned it off completely? Just check. I'm sure you've all seen this happen, and then you feel dreadfully embarrassed. So just check now. That's great. And in case of fire, just be guided by the ushers. Follow the fire exit signs. So just a little bit on the theme of the day. When I introduced this last year, there was a report from the BMA, but also Dying Matters Week has done quite a lot of surveys on this. Dying Matters Week is now in its 10th year, I think, and it happens in May. They have their own website, which is really worth looking at because they're accumulating a lot of material. And through these surveys, they've found that with the British public, only 35% of people said they'd made a will. Somewhere between 10 and 30% had let someone else know about their funeral wishes. Only 7% had written down wishes or preferences about their care of what they would want if they couldn't make decisions themselves. And so it seems that these surveys are indicating that we're not particularly well prepared for our own deaths. And yet this is something that we all have in common. And you think about it, you think about now how much preparation there is for giving birth, say, for instance, all the options and the support and the information. And as common as giving birth is, we know that we're all going to die. And have we thought about it? Have we really made our wishes known? Are we prepared to accompany someone else on that journey, or even given thought about how I would like that journey to be for myself? So it brings us to really ask the question, as we know it's a normal part of the cycle of life, why are we afraid of it? Why do we not talk about it? We're often called a death-denying society. And I guess there are many reasons, and we'll be exploring them today. And one of the big ones is fear, because we feel we don't know what's going to happen. And I think after Peter Fenwick's talk, you'll be much more enlightened about that, because he's very going to give us a lot of data to look at that question. But we have a fear that it might be painful, a sense that it's out of our control, we don't know when or how it's going to happen. And also there's the loss for those left behind, and certainly grief is often a very difficult and painful emotion that we're not very good at handling. So given that context, we're going to explore these themes today. First of all, Peter Fenwick will be sharing what happens when you die. Then Andrew Martin, who's chaplain from the LOROS Hospice, he will be sharing about spirituality in healthcare. We'll do a workshop this afternoon where we're going to look at those questions for ourselves about really what would I want to have for myself if I knew I was going to die soon, or how could I be with someone else who's dying? So the workshops will be quite personal and deep. And then this afternoon, Sister Maureen from the Brahma Kumaris, she will be sharing with us some thoughts about more deep spiritual aspects of death. Peter is Emeritus Professor, Academic and Clinician of King's College London and the Institute of Psychiatry, Neuropsychiatry and Neurophysiology, and also of the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford. Peter's been an absolute pioneer in the area of consciousness. He's always been fascinated by consciousness on many different levels, and has written numerous papers on brain function, meditation, altered states of consciousness, and most recently a lot of work on dying, including a book with his wife Elizabeth, is Elizabeth here still? Yes. There, Elizabeth, yes. So Elizabeth's a co-author on the art of dying. He's also president of the Scientific and Medical Network. We're really honoured to have Peter come back and speak to us. He delivered this talk last time, and it was so uplifting. You know, we all thought, wow, we can't wait to die. So I hand over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Let me start by saying what an amazing place this is. It's my first time here. The atmosphere in it is just wonderful. Some of you may not have to hold on to railings now. I do. So the quality of the railings are very important. Feel the woods that they've put in this place. Absolutely amazing. So lovely quality of the people in it, lovely atmosphere, and built beautifully. So let me thank the Brahma Kumaris very much for inviting me back. It's a real honour to be invited back. Usually one talk and that's enough. In fact, what I've done is I've taken the title that Sarah had, Shining Light on Death, as a really most important title, because that's exactly what we want to do. We want to just shine light on it so that we can understand it. And it raises amazing questions. Just let me ask you, okay, a week, it's quite a long time. How many of you have thought about death in the last week? You're a cool lot, aren't you? Usually they're one or two, but obviously you're much more informed. Yes, it's very important, because that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to all need it. And so we know little about the dying process. We don't realize how important it is, and please, it is important. How many of you have decided where you're going to be buried? Yes. Not good, is it? I know what I want. A huge monument. Huge! And the family are all saying, too big, too big, too big. Yes, I think we need to have some sort of ideas of what we'd like. And because we don't look at this, because we have to be concerned that it's going to be very painful and that it's not going to be looked after physically. So we're all attached to life. Agreed? And we won't face death. Agreed? If there was a door there marked death and a door there marked lectures on death, which would you go through? We'd all head for the lectures on death. Because in our culture we fear death and shut it out by not discussing it. We still do not understand and have just started to study the subjective and spiritual processes of dying. And when I started on this particular journey in 2003, you couldn't talk about it at all. There are very few studies of phenomena surrounding the time of death. Why not? As Sarah said, we're all used to birth. Why not talk about death? There is uncertainty about whether such phenomena are spiritual or organic in origin. But does it matter? Does it matter if we wish to say it's the brain doing this or the brain doing this, or we really have a spiritual understanding of what's happening? Many carers feel they lack training in how to respond when told about these phenomena. So what are these phenomena, these end-of-life phenomena? We really should know about them because they're going to be very important to us during that period. So we have done a little bit of work on with the dying, and this really is just an overview where we'll start. Premonitions, fairly clear, not terribly common. Last fortnight, deathbed visions. And then you move into a new reality. And this is where a lot of new data has come, and we must understand that. Terminal lucidity, I won't talk much about. It's just before death when amazing things happen to you. Like you sit up in bed having been paralyzed for years. Then you die. And there's deathbed coincidences. This is where the dying people go and talk to someone else. And then there are all the phenomena around death. And remember, death is a very, very important time, not just for you, but for the planet as well. And there's a huge change in consciousness. So things which are in relationship to you respond to this. Clocks will stop. Have to be your clocks, obviously. Animals, if you have a good relationship, they will know when you die. Bells will go off, particularly in the hospice. Lights are seen in the room of the dying, and shapes are seen leaving the body. But that picture's a little bit harsh. You're all nice and scared by that guy. Okay. Should we take him away? Yeah, I think that's better. What about this one? See if you like him better. Because that's much more like what it's actually going to be like. So, how well are our carers trained to recognize all these phenomena? So, we did a study, and we asked carers of the dying. By carers, I mean volunteers, nurses, who work in hospices. And you'll see on the left are the English people there, and the Dutch there, Irish there, and English prospective there. And you'll see straight away that the Dutch are really quite well trained, aren't they? nearly 80% of carers had been trained about end-of-life experiences. So there's going to be a marked cultural difference, whereas we in this country are very poorly trained. So let's look at some recent work which is changing our view on dying. This is a book you might like to get by Rowley in 2016, Seeing the Light, End-of-Life Experiences, Visions, Energy Surges, and Other Deathbed Phenomena. Now, why does it take 2016 to write books like this? Should they not have been in the literature? No, they're not. And what he says, spiritual care is an integral part of multidimensional palliative care, and a major domain of care identified in definitions and guidelines, but still we don't do it. Deathbed phenomena include visions, dreams, hallucinations, and premonitions, and pre-mortem energy surges, that's lucidity before death, which can be deeply spiritual experiences. So they're all there. However, they've been under-recognized. The last hours of life are not easily explained within a traditional medical model. So if you go to a traditional medical model, you won't find the sorts of explanations that certainly I think are important. Another book by Alan Kelleher, 2014, The Inner Life of the Dying Person. And this now does something which is quite new. Why has it taken so long for it to be new? This book recounts the experience of facing one's death solely from the dying person's point of view, rather than from the perspective of the caregivers, etc. And he goes on to say, at death, although there's suffering, loss, anger, and sadness, we can also feel courage, love, hope, reminiscence, transcendence, transformation, and even happiness when we die. So it's not going to be, or shouldn't be, the terrible, sad thing that we all fear it might be. Now, we wrote a book on this, The Art of Dying, myself and my wife. Actually, my wife wrote it, and I stand behind her and say, gosh, you write well. And we bought some copies up here. We're going to sell them for £10, and the money is going to the Janki Foundation. Now, you can get them from Amazon for £10, but then you have to wait. But you can give your money instead, if you want the book, to the Janki Foundation. And we also have prepared a leaflet called Nearing the End of Life. We brought some of these up. They're free. They've been funded by a charity. And so if any of you feel that you want more of these leaflets or they're useful to you, then let me know, because they are available. So then, let's look more at death now. And it's always good to start off with the Dalai Lama. And just see what he says. If you've not practiced rituals, that we can take as preparing yourself, and on your dying day, you're surrounded by sobbing friends and others involved in your affairs, you'll have to stop them. Stop sobbing, you say. It's okay. It's actually all right. Instead of having someone who reminds you of virtuous practices, this will only bring trouble, and you'll have brought it on yourself. Where does the fault lie? And this is the whole point, in not being mindful of impermanence. And if you look at his work, he's got a very, very clear view of what sort of society who doesn't think about death, doesn't realize that you're just a tenant passing through. They're greedy societies, they're angry societies, they're self-seeking societies. And when you die, this will be your bedroom, all those people. Or would you like this as your deathbed? Really comforting and nice and clean, and allow you to hold yourself in the infinite? No? But that's what we do to many of our people. Why? Why? Why can't we have special places for people to die? Well, we do have hospices. What percentage of people go to hospices? It's only something like 10%. It's very few. So then let us examine the death process. You get the diagnosis. It's terminal. You're going to die. You start the dying process. You're usually unprepared. This audience won't be, fortunately. But what does it mean to be unprepared? You enter the dying process with feelings of fear. Why? With feelings of anger and rejection. I'm too young to die. I don't want to go. With feelings of loss. Oh, those wonderful things that I'm not going to be able to do. With feelings of sadness. But if you enter with curiosity, and that's the word I want you all to take home, be curious. With feelings of acceptance and from a position of knowledge, then you really come to understand what it's going to mean for you and the people you love. So to progress easily to death, everything must be given up. When I say everything, I mean everything. You've got to give everything up. I don't want to. Oh, yes, you do. Because to hold on to it is not going to help. And remember, a shroud has no pockets. Say to yourself, no, a shroud has no pockets. I'm going to give everything up. But it's hard to give up. This is what one of the patients who was dying, whose bed I was sitting on, and we were talking about her death. And what she said is, when we were talking about giving up, she said, but who's going to look after my little car? I want you to actually see the sadness of that, because it's very profound. In fact, I don't think she's talking about her little car. I think she's talking about her daughter. But nevertheless, you can see how it radiates out. So, end-of-life experiences, or what we call LEs, give help in the final few weeks and days. So, you're not on your own. I'll repeat that in case you didn't hear it. You're not on your own. So we set out to find the nature of end-of-life experiences. We interviewed the carers of the dying starting in 2003. And believe you me, it was really difficult in 2003 because when I went to the ethics committee and said we'd like to talk to the dying about their experiences at the time of death or around the time of death, they said, no, we don't know enough about it, but you can do a carer study. And that was brilliant, actually, because we could now talk to the carers. And the first thing we found is that the hospices are split. Medical staff don't know the phenomena. Nurses see the phenomena, know it, and there's no communication between them. It's getting better now. So we did a 5-year retrospective and a 1-year prospective study. We did it in England, Holland, and Ireland. And there were 110 carers questions. 1 palliative care team, 2 English, 3 Dutch hospices, 1 nursing home, and an Irish study. And then I started talking about some of this data on the radio. We got emails, hundreds of emails from the public. So we built up a very large database of what actually happens. We interviewed doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, and volunteers. And those are the lovely co-workers, Sue Brain, a psychotherapist, Hilary Lovelace, who's gone to New Zealand, and Inika Kodam in Holland, and Dr. Una McColville in Ireland. Now, listen. The present consensus is that about 90% of those dying consciously will have an end-of-life experience. So when I say you're not left on your own, you're not. So let's start with deathbed visions. I joined my daughter after an hour at the hospital, and we both sat chatting to my mother. She spoke to me about my life and my future, all interspersed with references to these people who are now at the end of her bed. She told us that she wouldn't be there the next day, as these people would pick her up Do you see? She's already getting information about the dying process. She was totally at ease. She insisted that we shouldn't cry when she died. And in fact, when they came back the next day, she had died. So there is a very good example of the interaction between deathbed visitors and the actual dying process. How common is it? Well, remember what I said about our carers being trained. The first blue column is the English retrospective one, Dutch retrospective, Irish retrospective. That's the last 5 years, and that's when they were actually looking out for it. And so that gives 60 to 70% of the carers had heard that year about near-death experiences, so they're common. And we found that deathbed visitors often sit on the bed. Why? Why would you sit on the bed of somebody who's dying? Because it's very, very comforting. If any of you have children who are ill, what you do, you sit on the bed, hold their hands and talk to them. And that's exactly what the deathbed visitors do. And is it common? Yes, it's very common. That's over 60% of the carers that had stories like that. So who are the visitors? Well, we took, in fact, 102 people, or 118 visions, and we asked that question. And in fact, parents are a quarter, 17% are spiritual persons, 14% they just greet them joyfully, holding out their hands like that, don't say anything. Other relatives, 14, and so it goes on down. Sorry, very few angels in this country. If you want angels, do you know where you go? To the Bible Belt of South America. There are loads of angels there, and they'll come. Friends, not many. We only got 3% in our survey. And you'll all notice that there's one category missing. What about your cats and dogs? Do they come? Very occasionally. They obviously have better things to do. But they do. Some of them do, in fact, come. And this guy who says, I thought it was going to be my mum. It probably is, in fact. At any rate, we've done away with that other guy. So who sees them? The dying. Rarely others in the room, and especially children. And very rarely hospice or hospital staff. So they're mainly there for the dying, although other people do see them. We might ask, how do they come? Often come into the room shortly before death, will stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room, appear to be in real space as the dying direct their gaze and comment at a particular place. In other words, they always talk to somebody there and then somebody there. Maybe more than one person, and occasionally unknown people wait at the distance and come closer as death approaches. These people are usually described as being spiritual. So again, as death comes closer, so you get even more help. Why do they come? To greet them, to reassure them that they will be with them. Do you remember I said you won't die alone? And you won't. To tell them when it's time to go, to take them on a journey. They can be negotiated with and the time of death delayed for a short while. Okay, I don't want to die right now. Why? They'll say. You'll say, hospice party, and they'll say, oh, no, you're coming with me on Tuesday. My son is coming from Africa and he won't be here till Wednesday. That's okay. And you can stay a little bit longer and talk to them. Here's a nice one on delaying tactics. My sister Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room. Fearing that one of her children had gone in and upset him, she went in to see what was going on. Only Dad was there in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go yet. He knew I was coming and was determined to stay alive till I'd seen him. So there's a little bit of negotiating power which you should know about, because you might need to use it if there are people who are very important to you. So now we come to where the biggest growth in our understanding of death is, and really it's the most important. And this is this new reality. I first of all heard about it when I was sitting on a beach in Jamaica at a conference, and the person I was talking to, she was telling me about her daughter who had died. And the daughter said that she had gone into this space, which was, there was a dark ceiling, and above it there was this space of light and love, compassion. And she went into it, met spiritual beings and some of her dead relatives, and then came back again. So it was an alternation between these two spaces. And so I've called this a new reality. And it's part of the transformation of consciousness which goes on. And now, as you go through that, do you see I've taken that guy away, and you yourself will enter a new state of consciousness. And I've put the words there, non-dual consciousness. This means, in essence, that you become cosmic. You, in fact, lose your own personal identity and grow into the whole universe around you. And we've got data on that. So this is the story which I just told you about a 32-year-old woman who told me about this idea that she went into another reality. And when she was there, everything would be okay. There were loving beings. They all say it's not a dream, it's very real. Her grandfather was amongst them, and she moved in and out of this area. Here's another one. My father was at my grandfather's bedside, deeply distressed. But my grandfather quietly said to my father, "Don't worry, Leslie, I'm all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry." And he quietly died, lucidly to the end. So it doesn't have to be, clearly, a time of death and destruction. It's a time of death, certainly. But is it a time of death or a time of renewal? I'm going to suggest to you it is, in fact, a time of renewal, which puts a quite different spin on it. These are what the carers found. The Dutch, who are better trained, found this movement to new realities more than the English did, although when the English were a bit trained to look for it, they came up. In actual fact, that figure is now running to about 90%. So there we are, the journey, the new reality, the change in consciousness. And remember that the transformation of consciousness is part of the process of death, and something we'll all go through. So what is this transformation of consciousness? Experienced by 90% of the dying. So you probably won't get away from it, guys. It's very like the NDE world. Full of light, full of love, full of care, full of compassion. Wholeness and feelings of unity. In other words, you tend to shed your personal sense of who you are to take on a much wider sense. It's a waiting area with spiritual beings, and your dead relatives are present. So that's towards the transformation of consciousness. An example, my life partner died of AIDS-related pneumonia at home in 1991. I spent the last week lying beside him at home much of the time. And on one or two occasions, a look of sheer ecstasy lit up his face as he smiled and looked at something I couldn't see. And it's these people are pulled towards this ecstatic new world. Now, there has been a paper which I would all like you to read, and it's by Monica Renz. It's a very important paper, in my view. And she's a palliative care theologian, and she did a most amazing study. Now, I'd like you all to read it. How are you going to get the paper? Very simple. You all have email, so write that down, Peter_Fenwick at CompuServe.com. I don't need any hi Peters, and wasn't it great being in Leicester? All I want is in the subject title, Monica Renz, and I'll send you her papers, okay? So there's no excuse now for you guys not knowing about this. And this is what she is saying. Spirituality includes more than just giving a response to a patient's spiritual attitude. Spiritual needs, as well as patient's consciousness and communication, are changing. Please understand this. You're not going to, when you actually die, you're not going to die with the level of consciousness you have now. It's going to be different, because consciousness is changing during the dying process. Spirituality has to do with an altered connectedness and consciousness. And spiritual experiences are powerfully independent of religious attitudes. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are a materialist, that's a very strong religious attitude, everything is material. You'll go through the same process. If you belong to a religion and hold your religion strongly, you'll go through the same process. So the dying process looks after you. Monica Rentz has written a book called Dying a Transition, and it's worth reading if you're interested. She argues for, and I would agree with this, 3 phases in dying, what she calls pre-transition, transition, and post-transition. I'll explain those a bit more in a moment, but just to see the power of her study, 80 patients in this series, she's done more since, at least 3 observations a day she's looked at 4 dimensions: fear, pain, denial, and spiritual experience, just the sort of dimensions I'd like to know about. And from those observations, she determined the transition level. Now, remember, what I'm suggesting to you is that the process of dying is an expansion of consciousness. It's not a contraction. And this goes towards the data to support that. And of course, it's a new concept. Again, tell one of your friends, when you die, your consciousness is going to expand, and they'll probably hit you. It's not really considered true. But that's where I think the data is pointing, and as more data comes out, what Monica has found, I think, will be validated. In pre-transition, this is your coming up to dying. It's about a week before. You may feel needs, thirst, needs of bonding, pain, and emotions. Many fear losing control and dignity and realize that dying is inevitable. That's a very important change point, that dying is inevitable. And what will stop you in that level of progressing you can be locked in pre-transition due to denial. I'm not really dying, guys. This is just a little blip. Reactivated traumas, the terrible life. Now, what I want you to see, do you remember I said you must clean? Means you must give up your traumas, give up everything like that. But if you're drawn into them, then you get a rather difficult dying process. Struggles of any sort, strong attachment, you have to give them up, or unresolved family issues. And she's just written another paper, which I just referred to, looking at forgiveness and the dying process, and awareness of your previous negative behavior. You're not interested in that. Give it up and just move on to the expansion of consciousness. So to help them through this period, and this is where any hospice workers here, great. Make sure you take the pamphlet. And I'd be interested in your validation of some of the ideas that we're putting forward. So to help them through this period, support and release from attachments may help patients to move on. So if you see somebody is caught, sit quietly beside them and let them talk to you about it if they want to. Now, when you move from pre-transition to transition, it's a sort of resting phase, but you're beginning to get this change in consciousness I've been talking to you about. So transition implies a loosening of ego consciousness. It's this feeling that I am here and doing things. That's what tends to go. Patients typically show physical signs of anxiety and struggle. Well, some patients simply stare or are restless, and traumas may be inactivated. It's sort of resting state before you come to the last one, post-transitional spiritual opening. The ego is not dominant anymore in this level, and the words that you have to look at are non-symbolic, non-dual consciousness. It's one of our ideas about consciousness. It's where you actually join the universe. There's a very good book on it by Dr Martin called The Finders. If you can just remember The Finders and put it into Amazon, you'll probably get it. Now, patients seem to be serene in a state of being beyond anxiety, pain, or powerlessness. Do you realize this? This is the last stage just before you die. Many are unable to speak and still hear, and often communicate by gestures or single words. Sometimes reconciliation, visions, and peace are observed. Such transformative experiences may be comparable to a spiritual awakening. So I'm going to suggest to you that, in fact, in some cases, dying is a spiritual awakening or completion of the journey. She's published a number of graphs, and I like this one because it sort of seems to show the stereotype. This is pre-transition up at the top here. I expect you can't see this little red dot. I can. And then you go to transition here, and then you go to post-transition with the change in consciousness, and you die. These are days along the bottom. So it's a very clear view of what actually happens as people die. And once you have this as a map, when you go back to your hospices again, you'll find that a lot of what Monica says is in fact there, but you hadn't seen it. This is another one, pre-transition, right through to changing consciousness, back to pre-transition, a bit bumpy about it, and then finally with this expanded sense of consciousness before she died. I don't know if any of you know Thetis Blacker. She's a religious painter that paints in batik. And she was one of the first people I met who introduced me to expanded consciousness a long, long time ago. And we had a pact that when she died, I would be there at her bedside to find out what it was like. And she was very good. She told me when she'd gone into hospital, into the hospice, but unfortunately I was in Japan at the time, so I rang her. And I rang her and spoke to her just 2 days before she died. And so I said, Thetis, what's it like? What's it like when you're so close to death? She said, there is a wonderful river of golden light pouring through the room. Now, none of the nurses would have known that unless they'd asked. Do you see, you get these astonishing changes in consciousness as people come up to death. And then you come to death itself. Now, you'll enjoy this, I think. This, again, is from Monica Rentz. It's part of this study of hers. And it's those things which protect from suffering. How many of you have had near-death experiences? Oh, not one? Oh, pity. That's an absolute protection from suffering. You know what it's like. And that is that one there. 90% of people had only mild suffering, which is the yellow, and severe suffering is the blue. And so I think that there are some things which stand out, and these are the main columns which I suggest. That's NDEs, that's meditation, and that's mystical experience. So all that area protects you when you're going to die. So make sure when you enter the dying process that you have a healthy meditation. And if you've had mystical experiences, then that will protect you. But what you need is this one. You can all have it. I am curious about after death. Curious. And look, that is just under 2/3 of the people are in fact protected from severe suffering just by being curious. So you can now see, clean yourself, give it up, be curious, then you're likely to transform. No fear of death at the time of admission helps a bit, but you fall into it very easily. Yes, that's denial, which of course is never a good thing. This is a nice one. I like to pray. So in fact, you have a wider sense of yourself than the limited one, that's 60%. So this gives us some clues as to what will help you at the time that you actually die. Now, this is her new paper, which you can get in exactly the same way. It's Forgiveness and Reconciliation Process in Dying Patients with Cancer. And reconciliation, as you've seen from the data I put before you, is going to be terribly important. And she notes that the forgiveness process, and the hospice workers would probably know what we're talking about, 5 phases: denial, I'm not dying; crisis, yes I am, I can't face it. And that's very much Kubler-Ross. And then experience of hope can come after that, and forgiveness and reconciliation are very important. And so these are really what those looking after the dying have to be aware of, and that approaching death, patients seek forgiveness and reconciliation. This is the sort of thing in the last days before dying. Suddenly she stared intently up at the window. It only lasted minutes, but it seemed ages. She suddenly turned to me and said, "Please, Pauline, don't ever be afraid of dying. I've seen a beautiful light and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful. I really had to fight to come back." And sadly, she died the next morning. So just a confirmation of what we've been talking about. And another one, I was nursing my friend who had definite views, and I want you to listen to this, that there was no afterlife. Okay, good materialist, all in the brain. Sorry, guys, when the brain shuts down, so do I. Wrong. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful and arose from her unconsciousness periodically, saying clearly and happily such phrases as, "I will know soon. Come on, get on with it then. I'm ready to go, and it's so beautiful." She'd immediately lapsed back into unconsciousness after uttering these phrases. She's very obviously contented and happy. So, the other thing I want you to get is that if you have firm belief structures, these won't necessarily override the death process, and they didn't with her. So you should be able to die where you want. How many of you want to die in hospital? Oh, I've scared you all. How many of you want to die at home? Yeah, all of you, of course. I think we ought to have special spiritual units and special spiritual hospital units. So if you're going into hospital and it's clear you're going to die, then I think you need the sort of care which we've been talking about. Now, it's terribly important to have the right hospice, and the search for a hospice where you can be looked after is very important. And I found one in Rotterdam. There's such a house, a small hospice called De Vier Vogel, the Four Birds, staffed by 2 wonderful nurses, Simone de Kuiper and Suzanne van Westerbrugge. And they run this hospice with volunteers, and it's an amazing place. It's like coming into the Brahma Kumaris house, this house, but multiply that feeling by 10, feeling of love, support, and care. They confirmed that the phenomena we've been talking about today regularly occur in their hospice. They're there. And they describe a strong emotional pulse of love felt in the room of the dying. But to feel this, you, of course, have to be quiet. They ring Tibetan chimes when somebody is passing, and finally, a candle is lit for the relatives to take home. Now, I just want to tell you one short story to end with. An old friend of mine, Professor Paul Robertson, had an NDE some years before he died, but you know that in fact, because he's had an NDE, he'll be protected. He was leader of the Medici Quartet, and he had an operation that stopped his heart, and he was cooled while they mended his aorta. And in his near-death experience, and I want you to listen to this, he was fully aware that he was dying and moving from this state to experience the potential unification of his consciousness with that of the universe. As I lay there waiting, I felt myself die, beautifully, ecstatically, transcendently. I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. So you get the power of this. So why in these circumstances did Paul come back? Basically because his family pulled him back. And I had an agreement with Paul, obviously, because I had a long discussion with him about dying, that I'd be there when he died. And so when he died, I went down to the hospice, but in fact, he didn't die that day. He died the next day. And his wife was there. And as Paul died, he came back from his sleep, probably coma, and told me, I must let Peter Fenwick know that there's nothing new. We've all been there before. In other words, somebody right as low as you can get and still able to communicate confirmed what we're talking about. So the final transition is the crumbling of the ego. Subject-object consciousness, or what we have now, transforms itself into divine consciousness. And what I would like you all to do is to think, as I lay there waiting, I felt myself die beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally. I saw eternity, shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. It would seem that we were never born and we will never die. So guys, what are you afraid of?
Dr. Fenwick, may I ask you, please, that's wonderful, and may I recommend people to read your book, because it is a marvellous book, and I almost know that off by heart. But could you say just a couple of words? I know you like brief answers, but could you say a couple of words, please, about the position of those who die perhaps in more unfortunate circumstances, the battlefield, someone who is drowning, someone who commits suicide? Could you say a little of that, please?
Accidents are a real puzzle. What's going to happen, because they don't have this preparation. The Dalai Lama will tell you they do have that preparation, that we know 2 years before we die that we're going to die. I don't understand what he says, but that's what he says. So I take the near-death experience as a very good example of that. Leave your body down a tunnel, meet your dead relatives, know if you cross a bridge or something that you're going to die. So you're still held in love and care, etc., except it's a much quicker process. So I think accidents are okay. Suicides, we've had 1 or 2 suicides. Yeah, they're always sad, because a lot of times when they come back, they want to go back again. We had one person in hospital for a whole year getting out of that. Other people are depressed. So it's a combination of that. But at any rate, if you know about these things, then of course you can support them.
Are the near-death experiences affected by medication people take?
Was that meditation or medication?
Medication.
Medication.
Yeah, because very often I've seen in hospices, people are just so much doped up with heavy drugs that they are hallucinating from the drugs.
Yeah.
And they're not speaking rationally, and they have bizarre behavior, simply a side effect of the drugs.
It requires a sensitive nurse to be there with them. And they have to distinguish whether in fact they're having a spiritual experience or whether they are in fact upset because they're trying to clear things which they can't clear. And on the whole, the tendency is if somebody has got terminal anxiety, terminal restlessness, instead of seeing it for what it is and dealing with the psychological and spiritual components, you give more drugs. That's not a good way of doing it.
Hi, thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. If you're an individual that meditates daily and has their morning rituals or sadhana, would your expansion of consciousness be greater than, let's say, the materialist?
I didn't hear that. Can you say it again?
Yeah, if you're an individual that meditates daily, has
Yes.
their morning rituals or their sadhana,
Yeah.
would your expansion of consciousness during the stages of transition be greater and more expansive than the materialist?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, no doubt about that at all. Because you're going on the same sort of line, and you can meditate into silence when you start fusing with the background, becoming cosmic. And these are the same sorts of feelings you'll get right near to death. It's all part of the same thing, in fact. And that is an expansion of consciousness.
Thank you, Dr. Fenwick. That was really good. All I wanted to ask was, do people's religions and beliefs have a different way at the end of life care, or the experience of death?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because what we're talking about now is strongly held belief systems. If you are somebody who's very religious, it depends how you use your religion. If you use your religion moving towards a greater universal consciousness, then that's great. If you use your religion to just the words of it, rather than the actual change in consciousness, then it'll be like everything else. You just have to give it up. But the expansions of consciousness are fine.
Basically, question I have is when you lose loved ones, and I have had personal experiences, are you, especially a loved parent or a grandparent, where at that last moment you distance away from them? And I've had two experiences in my life with my grandmother, where I did see her the night before, and I held her hand, and she pushed my hand away, and next morning she passed away. My own dad, I saw him Monday night, and I was talking to him, doing a conference call from there. I'm not going to cry, because I know his memories are there. And next morning he passed away. But my brother was there, and my niece and nephew, who were from abroad, were there with Dad. What's the answer to that?
Yes. I think it must have been very distressing, and I can understand that. I don't know what your relationship with your grandmother was like. Was it a very close one? Yes. She may have felt that you were holding her back, and some people, in fact, prefer to die on their own by themselves. This is because, in some ways, it's a giving up of their own personal self, and they don't want other people to be there. And so I would put it into that sort of frame. Did it mean she was rejecting you?
No, I didn't feel that way. I felt she held my hand, and she was holding to the side of the bed. And then it's like she was detaching. I walked away as if that was detachment. And same with my father. He spoke to me. I gave him a hug. I walked away. In fact, I was in tears in the car, as if I knew I'm not going to see my dad, but I didn't. I didn't accept it. Next morning, I'm at work on a call when my brother rings me saying, Dad's passed away very peacefully, smiling, just had porridge for his breakfast. But I was distant away, and I was the closest.
Yes, I think what I'd like to do is to talk to you about it, if I may,
Please.
afterwards.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking Dr. Fenwick for a wonderful talk this morning.
I know, they turned it off. I wanted to thank you all for being such a great audience, and really nice to see that a lot of you have thought about death. And you don't have to think about it all the time, just occasionally. Know it's going to happen. And see yourself as a tenant passing through, rather than somebody who's here permanently. And be curious.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure we're all going to be curious now. We just have a short break now. Can I plead that you're back here